Welcome to the Child Welfare Information Technology Systems Managers and Staff webinar series brought to you on behalf of the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau, and presented by ICF International. Today's webinar is entitled Agile Procurement. I am Elizabeth Martinko, your host and moderator for today's webinar.
Contact information for presenters Dan Hon and Mark Hopson are as follows. Dan Hon, Technology Consultant to ACF. Email dan@verlittlegravitas.com. Mark Hopson, Innovation Specialist. Email mark.hopson@gsa.gov.
Attendees are encouraged to participate in our webinar with questions and comments. All of the participant lines are muted now, but we will open them for the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. However, please be aware that you can submit questions at any time using the GoToWebinar chat feature, and those will also be addressed during the Q&A session. For those of you wondering where the GoToWebinar Q&A chat box is, there should be a small orange arrow and list of icons, usually to the right of your screen. If you click on the arrow, that will open up a larger dialog box, and you will see a place where you can enter questions. If we should run out of time, we will respond to your questions via email. And should you have any additional questions after the webinar, you also can submit those to me at the email address listed on the slide.
Elizabeth Martinko can be reached by email at elizabeth.mertinko@icfi.com.
Also, if you have any topics that you'd like to recommend as potential webinars for next year, please do not hesitate to contact me. And finally, while this webinar is geared to Agile procurement, we know that some listeners have very specific questions about how CWIS will operate and about certain topics like Agile in the context of CWIS. We encourage the audience to send questions like that to cwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov, as shown on the slide, or just chat informally with your federal analyst.
CWIS-specific questions can be emailed to ccwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov.
The Division of State Systems within the Children's Bureau continues to provide a series of monthly webinars supporting information sharing and discussion. Understanding who is attending the webinars helps to identify content that is applicable for everyone participating in an agency's CWIS efforts. So at this time, I'm going to start a poll, and I would ask that you identify yourself by role. If you're participating in a room with a group, if you could select the category that best matches the majority of people in the room. And we'll just give folks a minute or so to answer.
A poll appears on screen to assess the backgrounds of those attending the webinar. 28% are State Child Welfare Infosystem project managers. 43% are State Child Welfare Infosystem program, policy, or technical staff. 0% are Tribal Child Welfare Infosystem project managers. 0% are Tribal Child Welfare Infosystem program, policy, or technical staff. And 30% are ACF/Children's Bureau personnel or ACF contractor staff.
And so it looks like today we have 28% State Child Welfare Information Systems Program Managers. By far our largest group at 43% is State Child Welfare Information System Program, Policy, or Technical Staff. And our final 30% is ACF Children's Bureau personnel or ACF subcontractors. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our presenters today. We have joining us today Dan Hon, a technology consultant to ACF, and Mark Hopson, an innovation specialist. Dan, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great, thanks very much. Hi, my name's Dan Hon, and I am a technology consultant to the ACF. I have been working with ACF and also the state of California on California's procurement and development of a new CWIS system that is using user-centered, agile, iterative, and modular procurement methods. And with me today is Mark Hopson from 18F. Mark, do you want to say hi?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I am Mark Hopson. As Dan mentioned, I'm with 18F. That's with the General Services Administration, part of the federal government. And our organization has been helping California with that, amongst many other projects related to both CWIS and other things across state and federal governments.
Great. So if we could have the next slide, please. Okay, so for today's presentation, we're going to cover two topics. We're going to cover Agile development and modular procurement. And I want to take just a little bit of time going through, giving an overview of these two topics, especially the titles, because it's very important for, I think, everyone to understand and for us to get our terminology right. Modular procurement and agile development encompasses two different topics, and we're going to cover agile development first. Agile development is an iterative method of making software that's focused on delivering valuable software to users early and often. It's different from modular procurement, and it's also not what we would call agile procurement. What we mean by modular procurement is when we break up large, monolithic, typically waterfall-style procurements into smaller modules to reduce risk. And simultaneously, we also look in modular procurement to procure in ways that also support agile and iterative development. So if we take a look at these two topics, as agile development as the how we do things, how we make software, once we've got the contract sorted out, and modular procurement as a way of breaking up what would otherwise be large, monolithic, multi-year, large-scale software projects into smaller pieces. Because of the way that these two topics work together, we're going to cover agile development first. So if we go on to the next slide. So agile development. And on the next slide, I'm going to cover 5 different topics today for an overview of agile development. So the first one, I'll be bringing you up on some of the history and some of the overview and intent, the vision of agile development. So what is agile development? Then we'll take a look at where agile as a methodology, as a project management and project delivery methodology comes from. We'll take a look at the differences between traditional and agile methods, so how you might be used to doing things and how traditional methods of software development and software project management are different from agile methods. Then we'll take a look at how agile works in practice. And again, we only have an hour today, so there's only so much that we can cover of that. And lastly, what normally happens is that people get a bit uncomfortable and a bit scared because agile and iterative methods represent a very big change in how you manage and how you run projects from day to day, both at the project team level and also at the executive level. So I'll speak a bit about how to help you feel a little bit less uncomfortable and a little bit less scared about how agile works and how you might be able to start bringing the benefits of agile in. So the first topic, what is agile development? So on the next slide, agile development is a way of delivering valuable software to users early and often. And there are 2 key points to this. So if we take a look at the next slide, I've highlighted valuable software and users because one of the big things about agile development is that it gives you the opportunity on a regular basis for you to make decisions about what is valuable software, and it provides you with a way of concentrating the way that you answer that question of what makes valuable software, to concentrate how you answer that on the users who are going to be using it. So let me quickly contrast this with typical requirements-led waterfall development. So with requirements-led waterfall development, you're going to go through a big process of gathering requirements. You'll sit down with stakeholders. You'll have your project team sit together, and you'll make up a big long list of everything that your software needs to do. And in some cases, you may even look at federal and state regulations and legislation that explain what it is that your software has to do. And it can be very easy to write requirements in terms of what the software has to do, in terms of thinking about what it has to do for users. So one of the big principles of agile development is to reframe that whole way of thinking about what the job of the software is to put the users front and center of that software, and to say that this software needs to do valuable work for those users. It has to be valuable for those users. So it means that we need to spend a lot more time, and we put a lot more emphasis on understanding those users, not just at the very beginning, but throughout the entire process. And we work to understand, as the project proceeds, what is valuable to those users, what can help them do their jobs, what can improve the way that they do their jobs. And you'll start to see that because of the way Agile development works, as we find out, as we get more feedback, as our users understand and start using the software that we provide to them, they may have different opinions and they may have different needs that change over time in terms of what's valuable to them. The next part of Agile, or rather the kind of the second big principle on the next slide, is this principle of delivering valuable software to users early and often. One of the big tenets of the Agile and iterative software development methodologies is that we put a lot of value on getting feedback from putting real working software in the hands of our users, because it's only when we put working software in the hands of users that they're able to tell us whether it's useful or not. It's significantly harder for users to do this job when they're looking at screenshots in the abstract, when they're not actually doing the day-to-day work, when they're not using the software. One of the reasons why we do this in Agile and iterative development is because we've seen what happens or what can happen in traditional waterfall software development, where we go away and we spend a very long time, maybe 1, 2, 3, 5 years developing all this software, and then after that we go into a phase called user acceptance testing, and we put all of this work that we've done and we put it in front of a user. And by that point we have spent maybe 5 years worth of effort trying to figure out exactly what these users are going to need. And it means that we miss out on that ability to gain early and regular feedback. So Agile and iterative development methodologies make the concept of putting working software in front of our users very early on in the process. So potentially 2 to 4 to 6 weeks after a contract has started, and then repeatedly going through that process of getting feedback from our users, and then iteratively developing, iteratively improving our software over time. So on our next slide, I'll talk briefly about about some history of where Agile comes from as a methodology. So most software projects fail. It may feel like this, or if you've been working with software for a long time, you may feel that this isn't necessarily new to you. But when we say that most software projects fail, what we mean is probably one of these three things: that they don't do what we want, or rather they don't deliver the benefits that were promised, that they're too late, or that they cost too much. Normally at least one of those three things, and in the worst case all of those three things. So not only do they not do what we need, or they don't work properly, but they're also late and they have cost too much, or they've gone over budget. And there's a regular report that comes out from a group called the Standish Group, which are a technology consultancy, and they've been producing for a few years now, I think over 10 years now, a report called the Chaos Report, which is a large-scale industry survey of software development projects. And what they've found over time is that only 3%, and this is from their 2015 report, only 3% of large-scale software projects that use the waterfall methodology succeed, which isn't a great number. And Agile is a reaction to that traditional waterfall way of making software. And what we've seen is that it works. Agile projects are more successful at large, medium, and small project sizes than the traditional waterfall method. And we've seen that they deliver business functionality earlier too. So Agile has grown up over the last 20 years or so as a reaction against, or rather as a group of software development practitioners wanting to find a better way of building software, a better way of building software that meets the needs of its users, that software that doesn't just tick boxes, but software that actually helps people in their day-to-day jobs, so that you don't end up with a mismatch between requirements that were worked out or gathered at the beginning of a project and what you find out that your users need by the time you get round to implementing and releasing. And what they also wanted to do was try to get to a place where we could get the benefits of better software sooner. So how do we do all of that? And that's where Agile as a methodology came from. The next thing that I want to talk about are some of the high-level differences between Agile and traditional software development methods. So you're probably used to requirements-driven waterfall methodology. In that methodology, you'll be used to going through a period of requirements gathering, and then you make plans based on those requirements. And then based on those requirements, then you go through procurement, which is where you select your contracting vehicle. You put together your estimate based on your requirements, and then you go out to your vendor, and your vendor either with their bid provides an estimate of schedule based on your requirements, or they're required to do that as one of their first deliverables. Then your vendor and you go through your design, develop, and implement phase. After that, you'll do some user acceptance testing, and then you go into release, and then finally you enter the maintenance and operations phase. Everyone breathes a sigh of relief. You go into M&O for about 10 years or so, and then after that you realize that technology has somewhat overtaken you, and you go through the entire process all over again. And the reason why we call this the waterfall method is that on the next slide, as we see, all of these processes, all of these tasks are sequential. We have to get requirements first, and then we go down to the next stage, and then we make plans, and then we procure, and then we do D&I, and then we do UAT. And the only real chance to test if the requirements meet the needs of users is during UAT. Because remember, it's only until after we have our developed software, only until we have something working, and only until it's been all integrated together, that we have a chance to get some real feedback. So it takes a very, very long time for us, for users to get working software in the waterfall method. So if we jump ahead to, I think, slide 26 now. So Agile is different. What we'll see with Agile is that you end up doing pretty much everything that the waterfall methodology does, but we repeat it over and over and over again. And we call these repetitions iterations or sprints. So if we take a look at the next slide, where in a waterfall methodology we would have just gone through a requirements gathering process once, and then we would make plans, and then we would design, develop, and implement, and then we would check with the user, and that would be our overall schedule. What we do in Agile is we do that. We go through that process in every iteration. So in every iteration, in every sprint, in every repetition, we have the opportunity to validate our requirements, to go to our users and talk to them and do research and find out and check what do you need to do your job better, what does this software need to do, and how might we do it, and we plan. And then inside that sprint or iteration process, we do a round of design, development, and implementation. And at the end of that process, we have working software that does a small subset of the overall problem, but still delivers something valuable to our users. And then we put it in front of our users, and our users use it, and through using it, they're able to give us feedback. And we work with that feedback, and then we move on to the next iteration, and then the next iteration, and then the next iteration. And we keep doing that until we have hit our minimum viable product, or until we have hit, for example, until we have started delivering a complete set of functionality. So moving on to the next slide. At the end of each sprint or iteration, again, this kind of ties back to one of those two concepts that I highlighted at the very beginning of this section on Agile development. At the end of each sprint or iteration, the goal is to deliver working, valuable software to our users. So it's a very, very different model where we are working with modern software development practices, where we're working with modern frameworks, And fundamentally, if you're working with a qualified and capable software development team, there is nothing in principle that stops that team, or that should be able to stop that team from delivering a piece of functionality that's valuable to users inside of a short period of time. And typically that short period of time, that sprint or iteration, is between 1 and 6 weeks, and normally between 2 and 4 weeks. So how does all of this work? The end goal of an Agile project is still the same as a waterfall style project. So if you were, for example, to say that the goal of our project is that by the end of the decade, we want to put a man on the moon and then bring him back safely, then we could express that as an overall goal or as an overall vision for either a waterfall development project or an Agile development project. We've got our big audacious goal. We have pretty clear acceptance or win conditions, so we know how long we've got to do it. We know that we've got to get someone up on the moon. We know that we've got to get them back, and we also know that we've got to return them alive. Now, our waterfall method of doing that might be to sit down with everyone at NASA and then spend about 2 or 3 years or 5 years coming up with the perfect specification, or everything that our final Saturn V rocket needs to do. So we work very, very, very hard, and we deliver and we develop all of those requirements, and we sit down and we come up with a very, very intricate and highly detailed plan to do everything that we need to do to build a Saturn V rocket and to launch it and to take Neil Armstrong up to the moon and bring him back safely. We still want to do that with an Agile project. So when you think that an Agile project is significantly more flexible, or that there isn't as much accountability with an Agile project projects still have to deliver on the goal. It's still up to the executive sponsors. It's still up to your executive management and the team to agree on what that eventual goal is, because you don't get to just change your goal midway through. That isn't the type of change, or that isn't the type of flexibility. So, for example, it's not within the remit of an Agile software development team working on a CWIS project to suddenly say, you know what, we've changed our goal from CWIS to driver licensing with the DMV, and we're going to go do that now. Where we talk about flexibility in Agile development and iterative methodologies, it's flexibility in terms of deciding in the short term what helps us provide that early and frequent value to users, while still keeping that long-term goal, that long-term vision, and that project vision in mind. So another way of saying that is that in Agile, we're more concerned about the outcome instead of the implementation. Whereas requirements-led waterfall methods can be very, very specific about implementation. So when we're talking about requirements-led procurements and requirements-led waterfall development, we can go into a lot of detail where, for example, we would say there must be a mapping. There must be mapping functionality. It must use Google Maps. It must provide the ability for a caseworker to enter their current location and to get turn-by-turn directions to their next case or to their next client, so that they can plan their journey to the next client. Whereas instead of being so implementation-focused, with Agile methodologies, again, we're focused on delivering value to the user. So we're focusing on the what, and we are not as focused on the how, because we can always improve the how of value is delivered, the way that value is delivered over time. So an equivalent requirement in an Agile project that might be expressed, as I just gave that example about turn-by-turn directions with Google Maps where you can enter an address, is that we might write something called a user story, and we would say in that user story that there must be a way for, or rather as a caseworker, I want I need to be able to get directions to my next client so that I can plan my day, or so that I can spend my time more efficiently, or so that I don't waste time during my day trying to get from one place to another. And in an Agile development methodology, that allows us to successively improve how we implement and how we deliver the value against that user story, against that requirement over time. And what that means is that Agile fundamentally is about understanding the problems that need to be solved from the user's point of view. So it's a very, very big change in the way that we think about problems. We're always thinking about what is it that our user has to do, what would be valuable to them, and how are ways that we can provide that value to them. And how are the ways that we can provide that value to them in this sprint, in this iteration, and then we can improve it in the next iteration, and so on. And what's on the next slide is something that illustrates a concept that you'll come across in Agile development.
The illustrated example shown is an excerpt from Henrik Nyberg's CRISP's blog, which can be found online at http://blog.crisps.se/2016-001/25/making-sense-of-MVP.
A concept called the minimum viable product. And what this shows, I think, in a very helpful way, is a difference between on the top, being not like this example with the big cross through it. In the top example, I think what is helpful to look at is to see the top example as requirements-led development, where we've figured out what the problem is. And let's just say, for the sake of this example, that the problem is that our user wants to be able to get from A to B more quickly than walking. So the problem that we're solving is transport. And we've sat down in the top example, in the top half, and we've worked out, you know what, the best way to solve this transport problem is by building a car for our user. And with the waterfall development technique, what we would do is that more or less we would build the wheel, we'd build the first set of wheels, and then in step 2 we'd build an axle, and then in step 3 we would add the body, and then step 4 we would add the rest of the chassis and the engine presumably, and then our user is happy. And what we see with this process is that the user doesn't have anything that they can really use. They don't have anything that will solve the problem for them until we hit step 4. And in fact, the feedback that we get from the user in steps 1 through 3 is, what are you doing and how does this solve my problem? They're not very happy because nothing that we're doing or everything that we're seeing doesn't really do anything for them. And instead they have to wait until step 4, and actually it's only until we get to step 4, when we have something usable for them, that our user is able to tell us, okay, actually that's great, this car does solve my transport problem, or that they might have other thoughts about it and that there might be a different or better way of solving that problem. Instead, what we're looking at on the bottom of this example is an illustration of iterative product development. And we still have the same problem to solve. So we're still solving the problem of transport. We're still trying to help our user get from A to B. And what we're showing here in this progression from steps 1 through 5 on the bottom is, in step 1, we have this idea of a minimum viable product. So this minimum viable product, in the first example, is a skateboard. It's better than what the user has right now. They're clearly not completely thrilled about it, but it is better than walking, and it's faster than walking. And what we can do is that we can then improve upon that based on feedback, and then very quickly we can deliver them a scooter, and then a bicycle, and then a motorbike, and then we can get to a car. So that at each stage of development, the user is getting something that is useful to them. Now, the big difference, and one of the ways where this example falls down, is that there is not strictly a progression between going from a bike to a motorbike to a car. But for the sake of argument, in terms of software development, we can improve upon and iterate upon each of the solutions or each of the pieces of software that we deliver to a user at each of these stages to progressively enhance them. So what we start off with is, in stage one, our minimum viable product, and then we move on to improve that product. It's viable because it solves a problem for a user, and then we move on until we end up at stage 5 with an incredibly happy user who has a sports car. Now, the way that this all fits together is that you don't end up with, on slide 36, there is no, where you might have your single requirements document, or when I say your single requirements document, I've seen incredibly long Excel spreadsheets. You don't have your single requirements document, but instead, if we go back a slide, and we go, great, instead, in Agile, we have these artifacts, or we have these things called roadmaps, epics, and user stories. And a roadmap will broadly say, you know, this is what version 1 of our software should have in it. This is what version 2 of our software should have in it. This is what the alpha or beta of our software should have in it. And then what we do is, for each of those roadmaps, for that roadmap that describes the functionality that we would like for version 1, then we break up that functionality into epics, so groups of stories, groups of requirements, and then at the individual requirement level, we describe that functionality in terms of user stories. So for example, as a caseworker, I need to quickly gather information when someone is reporting that to me so that I can begin the intake process. So those user stories are very user-centric. They're focused on the tasks that the user has to do, and they're also focused on the outcome. So they're always comprised of 3 parts. As a user, I need to, the task that they need to do, the thing that they need to get done, and then the other thing that we add that normally isn't present in the requirements document is the so that part. So as a user, I need to do X so that Y. And that so that Y gives us really valuable context to understand the task that needs to be done and why that task needs to be done, so that we can evaluate different ways of valuably implementing that task in software. So what we have then, we collect all of those user stories together, and then they form what's known as the product backlog. That product backlog is the nearest equivalent that we have to our traditional requirements and specification. And what we're able to do in the Agile method, in iterative methods, is to revisit that product backlog. That product backlog isn't a frozen document. It isn't a static document. Because remember, one of the key principles of Agile is that we're delivering valuable software to users frequently, early and frequently. So if we find out that what's valuable to users changes over time, then what happens is our product owner, on the next slide, our product owner or our service manager, they are the person with the business understanding coupled with technical support. They make the final decision as to prioritizing what's in that product backlog. So if you think of the product backlog as a list of all the things that the software has to help users do so that they can accomplish tasks, every sprint we're going through that product backlog and we're looking, is this the right priority for us to do things in? What will deliver the best value? What will deliver value to our users right now in this next sprint? And that means we can still add things to the product backlog. Sometimes they may be high priority and sometimes they may be low priority. But it means that we don't have a static document, because what we're looking for in Agile, one of the things that Agile gets us is it gets us flexibility. It gives us the flexibility to be responsive to feedback that we get from our users, and it gives us the chance to validate our assumptions when we put that software in front of users. So again, that whole cycle repeats and repeats and repeats. We always concentrate on delivering functionality. And again, that gives us feedback, and it gives us validation, and it gives us the flexibility to deal with it. This invariably, in the last part of the Agile topic, leads to a lot of people in government technology being uncomfortable and scared because it's a very, very different way of doing things. It means that everyone needs to be comfortable with the fact that we can agree on an overall vision and a goal for our project, for our software, but that we let go a little, or rather the actual project team, the implementation team, gets a lot more responsibility in terms of deciding and prioritizing what is most valuable to its users, to their users, and then delivering that value frequently. So on the next page, this will be very, very different to what you're used to. Because instead of having the security, instead of having the luxury of saying, well, all we're going to do is implement what was in that requirements document, where we all went through the requirements gathering process, we now have the ability, if we change our minds, if it turns out that we actually need something else or there's a different or better way of doing things, we can do that now. But again, that comes with the responsibility of constantly reprioritizing and making a long-term big change in terms of effort and understanding and collaboration with your users and your customers in terms of understanding what they need and frequently delivering it to them. So that covers, in a very, very whistle-stop way, and very quickly and at a very, very high level, some of the principles of Agile development. And now we're going to move on to modular procurements. So, modular procurement, we're going to cover 4 topics here. What is modular procurement? Why does it exist? How does it work? And then, once all of that has happened, then how might you go about persuading decision makers, or how do you develop an environment that is conducive to modular procurement? So let's move on to the first. What is modular procurement? So, modular procurement is a way of preventing big technology projects from becoming too big to fail. There are kind of 5 high-level things that modular procurement is designed to do. It's designed to deliver faster. So it's designed to make sure, or designed to help people get software or get the benefits of a project in months, not in years. It's designed to decrease investment risk, so the risk that $500 million later, 4 years and $500 million later, that we reduce the risk of essentially having thrown those $400 million away with something that either doesn't work at all, or that in significant cases doesn't do what we need to do. It's designed to increase flexibility. So again, this is where modular procurement kind of ties into what we're doing with Agile development. What we're recognizing with both of these approaches, with Agile development and modular procurement, is that when we actually start doing things, we start getting feedback. And with the best will in the world, our most researched assumptions may turn out to be wrong or might just need changing. And that's okay, because that's just how the world works. We can never know everything that will happen in the future completely clearly. So how do we increase our flexibility to be able to deal with that? It's designed to make performance more visible. So how can we hold vendors to account more clearly? How can we see how they're doing? And it's also designed to make failure cheaper. We would much rather fail at a cost of several $100,000 than fail at a cost of tens of millions of dollars. Mark, is there anything that I've missed in terms of the highlights of modular procurement there?
No, although I would change one thing, which is that the traditional way of doing contracting, which is also known as the Big Bang approach, grand design, is actually too big to succeed, not too big to fail. I wish that it was too big to fail, but the long, sad history of such arrangements, whether you're in the private or public sector, as Dan mentioned, there's an excellent chaos report that's been going out for several years. It's been exhaustively studied. The longer that your contract is, the higher dollar value, the more complex it is, and especially if it's with a single company, you are guaranteeing the failure in terms of cost, schedule, and performance. So hopefully with the next upcoming slide, we can kind of explain a little bit more about alternatives to doing that.
Yeah. So on to the next slide. Why does modular procurement exist? And hopefully, Mark effectively summarize why modular procurement exists. Big projects are risky. No one likes risk. Definitely people in government. We definitely don't like risk. Our elected officials don't like risk. Our bosses don't like risk. Really, we would just rather if everything was nice and predictable and we knew exactly what was going to happen every single time. We want things that work. We want things on time. And we want things on budget. Instead, as Mark said, large IT projects are often late and expensive, never mind that they also fail to meet requirements. And again, our recent reports and recent research has shown, as I mentioned earlier, that 3% of large-scale waterfall projects succeed. And I completely acknowledge that a lot of the Big Bang approach is purely down to environmental constraints. So especially in the way that I've spoken to state leaders in California and in other states, the budgeting process can be one of the reasons that leads us down having to use or feeling like we have to use a too big to fail approach. If we only have one shot to get the money that we need for a project, then the temptation is very real and the temptation is very easy to keep loading into it and loading into it and loading into it and effectively doubling down, or if I mix my metaphors, to put as many eggs as we can into one basket. And unfortunately, what we've seen over time is that the larger that we make technology projects, the longer that we make them last, the less likely they are to succeed. So, how does modular procurement work? First, I'm going to take you through some terms. So, on slide 57, we're going to build up a graphic here, a wonderful PowerPoint graphic. So if we go back one slide, please. So that big blue box at the top, that big box is your investment. That's your overall project. So normally it would be your, or in California's case, it's their $500 million multi-year, 6-7 year long monolithic waterfall, single award, one big system integrator waterfall project. And this blue box would normally be everything that you do. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to think about the investment that you are going to do in your service or the system that delivers a service. And historically, we have a one-to-one mapping. This investment is the project. It is that big. It takes that long. It takes up exactly the same space. And what we're trying to do in modular procurement, moving on to the next slide, is we're breaking up that investment. We're breaking it up into individual and useful projects. So we still have the goal, our overall project goal, that would have been our monolithic waterfall project. That goal is still applicable to the investment, but we break up that investment into smaller projects so that we can concentrate on each project with the overall intention of delivering against the entire investment. So we'll split that overall investment into individual and useful projects. A big change here is that projects should deliver useful software quickly, in as little as 6 months. It doesn't do us any benefit if we take a very long multi-year monolithic procurement and then we replace it with very long multi-year projects. Because remember, our big goal here, those 5 things that we talked about, we want to deliver faster. We can deliver in months, not years now, and we can even deliver in weeks. We want to decrease risk. So if I were to say that the way that we're going to deal with a problem is to make it even bigger and to pile even more requirements into it, then hopefully you'd say that that's not a really good way to reduce risk. But what we really want to do here is we want to make all of these projects as small as they can be whilst they can still deliver useful software, because we want to shorten the cycle, the time that it takes for us to get to valuable feedback and reduce the risk. So then moving on to the next slide, each project is then made up of individual activities. And of each of those activities should be completable within 90 days or less. So there are 5 key principles that apply here. And actually, before we go on to that, Mark, anything on that section that we just covered?
No, I think that's enough of a high level. I think let's get into some, how does this actually work?
Great. So how does this work? So there's 5 key principles that you need to keep in mind if you're going to use this approach. So the first one is that you absolutely need to use multidisciplinary integrated project teams to identify the functional, technical, and other capabilities and characteristics of each project. So you aren't going to be successful if you use a traditional method of program staff kind of throwing things over a wall to procurement staff or contracting staff. You're going to need all of those people working together, and in the same way that I talked about earlier with Agile development, you're going to need to use your users. And that leads us on to our second point. So in our second point, involve end users early and throughout the entire process. Your requirements, what your software needs to do, the problems that your software needs to solve, the value that you find out that your software needs to deliver will change. And hopefully, or rather, I'd be disappointed if it didn't change. It will change as you gain a better understanding of what your users need. On point 3, your multidisciplinary teams must work with contracting and procurement teams to develop an acquisition strategy to support the intended results. So unless your contracting and procurement team also know that you're breaking up this big project, that you need to see that your project architecture is intended to see activities that are completable within 90 days, that each project needs to deliver valuable working software in months, then everyone needs to understand that, so that everyone understands, well, this is what we're trying to do with this. This isn't a case of using an existing contracting vehicle to try to do something different. It means that a lot of things are going to need to change in concert. The next point is that this is going to require you taking and paying attention in a different way than before. So you are going to have the ability, and you'll need to use this ability to manage cost and schedule at the project and activity level, and to make cost and schedule targets for each activity. So part of the deal with this is, as you are breaking up the overall investment into individual projects, you have the ability to get greater insight. You have the ability to develop clearer accountability, and to understand what's happening to make sure that each of those projects and activities deliver on these shorter time frames. And then lastly, to go with that, you should be deciding performance measures and outcomes early on. So again, this is an opportunity for you to say, well, this is the type of value that our project should be delivering, not just in terms of requirements, but in terms of outputs. What are the type of key performance indicators that we'll be looking at? So you're looking at 2 different things here. You're looking at monitoring development in the actual project, and also you're monitoring the performance of the software that is built as part of the project. Anything on those, Mark, you want to jump in there on those?
Sure. So the thing that I think gets lost in this conversation, and I think Dan has done a great job of pointing it out, is the reason why we have those cross-functional teams and the reasons why we focus on the end users is that so we can actually do things that are not in a vacuum. So with this, it really is, what is the value that you're trying to make be realized throughout this process? So I think I'm especially looking forward to Q&A section because I know that this seems a little bit abstract, but essentially at 18F, and especially with Agile development generally, whether you're doing modular procurement or not, the goal is that you have structured modules so that you actually see evidence, and that's the best performance measure. There are a lot of things that folks have tried to do over the years, and I think somebody checked and there's at least 10 different process and control processes for quality around this type of thing. But to us, the clearest way to do this is just through actual shipment of working code.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that we really want to get to here is it's the shipping of that working code. It's delivering software that your users are using and that they can provide feedback on that will be one of the biggest changes here. Because essentially, if at the end of the day, whether it's waterfall or whether it's whatever methodology, the whole point of these technology projects is to improve and make better the jobs of the people who are using that software. You know, at the end of the day, we're talking about child welfare systems. So how does that software, for example, help caseworkers spend more time with their clients? How does it make sure that they're not wasting their time on mundane data entry tasks? How do we make sure that it gives them the time to spend time on the tasks that matter rather than administrivia? So again, we will never really get that feedback. All we will have is opinions about things until we put that software, until we see that software in production. So how do we get to that stage of feedback? How do we get to that stage of validation sooner? Because at the end of the day, we don't want to spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on software and then find out that it doesn't deliver the benefits that we need it to, and that, you know, worst case, it ends up frustrating our caseworkers. So what I'm going to do now is I'm definitely going to hand over the next section to Mark to cover modular contracting variety. Mark's going to talk about the different types of contracting vehicles and contract structures that can be used, and also he or I will talk about competition and how you can persuade your decision makers.
Sure, thanks, Dan. And before we go to the next slide, which I will, actually you can do it at any point, I want to emphasize that there is no wrong way, or at least there is not a singular way with which to do this. I think one of the things that I have noticed as folks have attempted to do modular contracting with IT services, especially in the modern era, is think that, oh, well, this is the one way to do this. It's not a paint by the numbers thing, and I think that's why we're emphasizing both the principles and also some of the key elements to take away from each of these things, regardless of the method that you decide to choose to try modular contracting. It's that you've hit all of the necessary elements with each one, and I'll try to call those out for folks to be able to comprehend a little easier than me just rattling off esoteric terms of art. So next slide, please. So this is called the IDIQ contract. Next slide. So the idea behind that is that, well, actually go back. I'll go to this one first. So the idea with an IDIQ contract is that, and this is the key, remember that we have emphasized that all of the evidence and data from, I think the first considered IT outsourcing contract was 1989 with Eastman Kodak outsourcing part of their IT operations to IBM. For those of you who follow business history, as we all know, that turned out to be a turning point for Kodak, and they are in every single aspect of our lives today. I'm being facetious, but the idea is that they went with a single contractor to do all of their work. An IDIQ or delivery order contract is the exact opposite. So in 1989, when that single award contract was made and hence kicked off the whole business segment of IT outsourcing, there were, I believe, some from the research I've seen, other people started to copy that big bang single outsource approach where you just outsource a huge chunk to a single company and hope that they do the IT system. In this case, it'd be that we'll just award one contract to X company to build the child welfare system. Well, after about 5 years of doing that across a variety of different business segments, folks noticed that didn't work. And so in the real world of procurement, most companies, especially modern companies, have moved to a multi-sourcing approach. And that's what an IIQ delivery order contract is getting at. So for example, in California and at 18F, you have heard of, or may have heard of, the idea of an Agile vendor pool, or we at 18F have our Agile blanket purchase agreement. It's another format of that type of contract. The idea is that we essentially qualify companies that can do development in a modern, agile way so that we have created a marketplace for the services that we need. We are not going all in, to Dan's point, of putting all of our eggs in one basket and hoping that nothing bad happens. Instead, we are being strategic and we are segmenting risk, minimizing it, and generating options for us so that we do not get locked in. And that's the idea behind an IDIQ. So essentially, to do one, you would say, this is what we're going to build. So for example, California, for those of you who've been following along, we're going to build this child welfare system. It's going to have these components. We're going to compete out those components one by one, but to start off with, we need to create that pool. So you create the pool, and then you do each of these separate modules depending on how you want to do it, depending on what your preference is. So that's one way to do modular procurement. Next slide. So the other way is that you can still do a single contract and not do the pool option, but you create what are called option periods, or you limit your liability by essentially creating an out for yourself. So to the point of avoiding a single award, long-term, high-dollar contract, you do not lock yourself into, for example, a 5 to 7 year contract. And to make this point, as Dan mentioned, not just the Danish group's chaos report, but there is another group of academics who've been studying IT outsourcing contracts in private public sector. And what they found is that for any IT contract that was less than 3 years, the success rate was about 87% in terms of cost, schedule, and performance. By comparison, the longer the contract went, the less successful it was in terms of cost, schedule, performance, for the reasons that Dan got to earlier, that you were too disassociated from your end users, the quote requirements changed, any number of things that happen over the passage of time. By locking yourself into a single contractual arrangement, you're guaranteeing that there's going to be misalignments. So the longer that you make your contract, the worse that happens. So the way to do this, and this is where we get to those key elements, is that you have generated alternatives for yourself. So you're avoiding getting locked in, and by doing that, you're saying, okay, well, you know what, we're going to try it with this company, and we're going to compete something. We're going to figure out who we think is the best, and we're going to give them 6 months or 12 months to do some development for us and see how they do. But you have designed the structure of the contract so that if they fail to perform, you are out of it. You're not locked in to continue, because now by making the turnaround time for delivery a shorter life cycle, it's not that, okay, well, we're going to award and then hopefully 3 to 5 to 10 years later we're going to see the payoff. You learn very quickly and you get that early feedback from this type of mechanism. Next slide. Successive contracts, similar idea, except that instead of doing it with a single contractual action, you can either do it by saying, we're just going to compete it, we're going to have a single contract that lasts for 6 months, we'll recompete it, it might go to the same company, it might not go to the same company, but to help us do this, we're going to just ensure that we're doing short, small contracts. I also call this treating a contract like a quiver of arrows. If anybody here is a hunter, nobody on earth out to hunt with a bow and arrow and takes one arrow. They take a quiver of arrows because this type of thing should be fast and easy, and you should use multiple ones. You shouldn't just go out with one big arrow and hope you can get everything. Next, please. Performance-based work statements. I cannot stress this enough. Regardless of the structure of the contract in terms of single award, multiple award, short duration, longer duration, the key to everything that Dan was pointing out in terms of how Agile development works is that the, quote, requirements are actually tied to things of meaning and value to the end users. So there's a lot of fantastic anecdotes with folks who are Agile experts who have come across the whole term requirements for the first time. One of my favorite stories was essentially that a Agile coach joined a team to develop software, and the team leader said, well, we need you to get to the requirements. And they spent about 3 weeks arguing over what that even meant, because the Agile coach kept asking, well, who is this for, and what is it supposed to do, and what is the problem we're trying to solve? And instead, they were provided with requirements traceability matrices in thousands of lines of a spreadsheet that are disassociated and numbered and hard to follow, instead of just actually going up to, for example, the caseworker and saying, hey, can you walk me through your day and tell me why you need a system to do something and what it serves? Allow them to solve the problem as opposed to doing that. So to that end, at 18F, we do not use what are called statements of work, where we tell our contractors, you're going to develop software like this. The system shall do that. The software shall do this. Instead, we provide them with what's called a statement of objectives. That's a format of a performance-based work statement, and say, here's what we need the software to do. We're relying on you in industry as our experts to do that in whatever way you see the best way to do it, so long as you meet these objectives. And those objectives are all based on the user stories that we have from our Agile development. Next slide, please. Thinking about competition. Next slide, please. So one of the other things, to the point of being locked in, is the idea of multi-sourcing. So to that end, one of the reasons why the IDIQ is a very popular option when it comes to modular procurement, like we do at 18F and like they did in California, is that by having a pool of vendors, you create a market economy, essentially, where you might procedurally have to do less steps than if, for example, you decided to do a single contract with options, or alternatively a successive contract, because it just means that you don't have to do as much administrivia, as Dan has said, in order to be able to say, hey, I have a batch of work that needs to get done. Here's my pool. They've spent a good amount of time getting to know who we are and how we work, and they know how to do this stuff. So we are going to just rely on them. But the key there is that not a single one of them has a locked-in deal. Like, not a single one of them is a sure thing. So they act as an enforcement mechanism to keep each other honest, not just in terms of price, which is incredibly important, because most of the time when folks do create IDIQ type contracts, one of the mistakes they make is that sometimes they do not create the ability to get people on and off of it if the IDIQ becomes stale, just like a pond. And so what happens is that the pond, if you will, stagnates, and the prices start to creep up, or the quality starts to go out. So the idea is to make sure that that pool of vendors is really high quality and matches what it would get if you went out into the actual market from scratch. So the idea is that you have a pool, just like California is doing, and now, as you can see, I believe, Dan, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but has California awarded 1 or 2 modules?
California has awarded 2 modules now.
Okay, thank you. So those 2 modules each went through what's called a fair opportunity competition, or there's various terms for it, but in essence you're saying, hey, pool, here's the chunk of work, tell me how you would do it, give me your price, and you move on with your life. So that's the way at least 18F and others who are advocates of modular procurement do that type of process in modern development IT contracting. Next slide, please. So same thing. It is more work, and that's something that I do not take lightly, and I do not say lightly, because folks, the one, I think, lure of the traditional way, especially if you are a procurement person like me, is that I only have to do, well, depending on how long your process is, a year of work, and then I go away until 5 years is up. They didn't deliver the system, but we know that we need to get a new one, so we do another bit of work. This requires much more engagement. So, for example, if anybody here has a smartphone, for example, the Apple iPhone has over 700 supplier contracts in order to get that one thing together. Same thing, if you take a piece of furniture, you're likely looking at a couple hundred different supplier contracts. That means that someone has to be minding the store and paying attention in a way that if I just say, deliver me a sofa in 5 years, and hopefully a sofa shows up, as opposed to having to deal with all those suppliers for the raw material, the manufacturing, the distribution, it requires much more attention. So next slide, please. The key is that whether you're doing it as a single award or multiple award in the way that we in California are doing it, is that you are ensuring that you have flexibility, that you have visibility, and that you are ensuring actual delivery. So that's where if you are doing a single award contract, you structure it as such that you are not losing those three things. Next slide, please. And I think I might bring Dan in here as well, because I usually advocate for the method of screaming at someone and slamming your shoe on the table, but he perhaps might be a little more persuasive at times than I am. Dan?
Yeah, so if we go to the next slide, please. So I think the big points here are to remember what modular procurement is designed to do. Because at least in the case of California, the points about what modular procurement is designed to do address a lot of the concerns about the current way of doing things that legislators and executives and secretaries and directors had already. So if we take a look at the next slide, the benefits of procurement are if you have, or for example, the way to talk about some of the ways to talk about modular procurement is that in some contexts, if your users have already been waiting for a long time, it may well be untenable, or it may well be untenable for your executive management to accept that they're going to have to wait another 5-6 years for something new. So modular procurement is a way to say, well, if it's important for us to get something new, something better into the hands of users earlier, then modular procurement is a way to go. If there has been a history of severe investment risk, or if people at finance and legislature are asking all the usual questions that they're asking about, well, how do we know this isn't going to be another $200 million or multi-million-dollar technology procurement that ends up the way that the other technology procurements are doing? What are you doing differently this time? And again, modular procurement is designed to help decrease investment risk.
Yep.
Increased flexibility isn't normally, I mean, it's great from the end user point of view, but I would say that increased flexibility helps if you end up having the conversation with people about what happens when you end up with a system, or have you ended up with previous technology systems that don't do what they're supposed to do, or where you have found that you've just had to change requirements and you just don't want to go through that change control process all over again. So if you have historical examples of, do you remember that last big procurement that we did, and then, you know, with the best will in the world, we found out that we had missed something in our requirements. We had to go back to the negotiating table with our vendor, and we had to figure out a way to get that done, or to just bite the bullet. If there's reluctance, or if there's a need to kind of address that kind of fear, then modular procurement is designed to address that as well. It's also designed, again, to make performance more visible. So if there's a history of needing to keep a closer eye on vendors, and again, if there is a need to, or if there's a need to show that there are ways to pull the plug earlier, or if it's going to be useful to make failure cheaper, then again, modular procurement is a way to address that. The other thing that we found that isn't on this list that is more environmental is that just because this is a different way of doing things is going to feel uncomfortable for a lot of people in the may well feel uncomfortable for a lot of people involved in the decision-making process, because fundamentally, you will probably have never done this before. So a big thing that we've been able to do there is that, for example, ACF has been offering assistance. I know that ACF has been offering assistance through 18F to states who are going down the modular procurement route. That there are resources from 18F and also from the US Digital Service in terms of guidance for modular procurement, especially at the federal level. So there is a growing community out there of people that you can talk to and support that you can get, both from other states as well as, I think, different types of support from the federal level, to reassure your decision makers to say, we're not doing this on our own, we're not the first people to do this, there are others who have gone before us, and also we can show where it's been successful. So I'm aware that we're running a little bit over time. Elizabeth, do we still have some time for questions?
We do still have some time for questions, so if I could turn it over to our operator, Amy. Amy, if you could let people know how to line up on the phone to ask questions.
Thank you. If you'd like to ask a question, please press *1. Please unmute your phone and record your name when prompted. It is required to introduce your question. Once again, that's *1 if you would like to ask a question. One moment.
Okay, and it looks as though we've also got some questions online, so I will go ahead and pull those up, and we can start with those. So our first question is, I have a current system that uses a waterfall approach, and much of the logic is hard-coded, and one small change can lead to many. My question is, could we convert our new system utilizing our current business process logic, or would we have to start all over again? I thought I'd start you with a nice, easy question.
Sorry, I was on mute. I can take this one. So the easy answer is it depends, or rather, the quick answer is yes. The more in-depth answer is it depends. So the question was they're dealing with a current legacy system. It was waterfall designed. A lot of the logic is hard-coded. Can we convert this, or would we have to start afresh? This is quite similar to the system that California is replacing. So they're moving from their SACWID-style system to their CWID system. And what we are using is we're using an industry-established pattern, which is unhelpfully called the strangler pattern. And what that does is that relies on replacing piece by piece and emulating the functionality of the old system and replacing that with functionality from a new system. That has tied up very well to using the Agile development methodology and to using modular procurement. So California State have used a modular procurement for the first piece of work that I think, in terms of answering your question, at least on the server, on the mainframe and database side, is going to untangling and modularizing and replacing all of that hard-coded logic into new independent modules that can then be used in a CWIS compliant system. So the short answer is yes, you can move from one to the other. You don't have to do a big bang complete replacement.
Okay, perfect.
The long answer is talk to your state systems manager at ACS, and I imagine that we'll be able to talk with you about various different options. And this is also something that 18F have been assisting states with as well, with Arizona, Mississippi, Connecticut, New Mexico, and I'm sure there are others that I have forgotten. But it's something that 18F also have experience with.
Fantastic. Next question, and I think this is directed towards Mark. So, too big to fail, too big to succeed. When Mark was making his distinction as well as mentioning cost factors, was he indicating utilizing multiple vendors for multiple modules helps to control and contain costs versus being locked into one vendor?
Yes, that's one way to do it. For folks that are interested, I am not just guessing. In fact, if you go and search the interwebs, which I believe is a series of tubes, you can find an article on IEEE, International Electrical Engineering something something, that's called The Lessons from a Decade of IT Failures. So in that chaos report, they actually go by industry segments to show who has the highest failure rates. And interestingly enough, for folks online who are from state or federal agency, government has the highest rate of failure. That is because they are the last group, besides big banks, that are still using a big bang, single award, high dollar value, long duration contract a la Eastman Kodak in the 1980s. For some reason, pushing up your blazer sleeves and synthetic music has gone out of style, but this remains, and government is the last group to do it. There's a lot of complications there, but everyone else in the real world treats their contracts as something that can be done cheaply, easily, and are fast. So it's that whole approach to multi-sourcing.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Amy, do we have any questions on the phone?
There are no questions at this time.
Okay, we have a few more that have come in online, and could you remind us again how folks can line up on the phone if they'd like to ask questions?
Sure, once again, that's *1 if you'd like to ask a question.
Perfect, thank you. I think for either one of you or both of you, multiple successive IT contracts will create additional burden on the contract management staff. How do contract units handle increased workload?
Sure. So I think part of that conversation is around the idea that Dan had mentioned earlier in the presentation, which is that you can't treat this as throw it over the wall exercise. Very typically, folks view each of these distinct offices either as a back office, front office dichotomy. There's a great British professor named John Seddon, S-E-D-D-O-N, who talks more about this at length, but part of the answer is that you can't just do this and then let the contracting folks figure it out on their own. You have to be an engaged equal partner with them to make it easier so that the conversations are not, on the one hand, supposedly you're going to go super fast, but then just leave it to the contracting folks to adapt without any assistance. So part of that is looking at existing resources to see, do they have the training and experience necessary? Do they feel like this would be too much? If so, that should not be a barrier to doing things well, because if you decide to go away from modular procurement, odds are you are likely going to end up in the same place, which is the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. We know that large-scale, big-dollar, long-duration contracts with a single supplier do not work. They just don't. If they work, it is a miracle, and it is very, very unlikely that even if it, quote, works, there's going to be failures in one of the different aspects of trying to judge the value of it with cost, schedule, performance. It's going to cost more, it's not going to be delivered on time, or it's not going to be what you needed, and you're going to constantly chasing something that you'll never catch. And that's also why we at 18F were established, because we're a digital consulting within the federal government to help agencies if they don't have the resources. So that's why one of the things that we focus on is training and building capacity and competency, not just in terms of how to do agile development, but in some of these other methodologies like modular procurement. So that's why folks like me are around to help contracting people, because I speak procurement to say, okay, here's what you're doing now, here's how this has to change, here's what we suggest, here's what you can do, and work through that together towards an actual sustainable path forward together as a program.
Yeah, and I want to be clear about this. I know that the question was about there being an additional burden on contract management, but my exposure and my work with the team in California, my work with other states and with 18F and with Mississippi, this approach, agile development and modular procurement, is more work for everyone. It's more work for the entire team, and it's also going to be a different kind of work. But the deal is that if you want to get better than that 3% success rate of large-scale waterfall projects, if you want the benefits of better software more quickly, or just software that works more quickly, if you want to reduce your investment risk, if you want to decrease the time it takes for you to get feedback, then these are the things that everyone in the team, the multidisciplinary team, are going to have to do. They are going to have to work together. That is as much, and I'm being completely candid and honest about this, that you may well have large cultural and organizational barriers in terms of being able to accomplish that. So where I've seen this be successful is where people can have a candid conversation about what happens when we do things the old way, what will it take for us to do things a different way, because we can't just do things a different way half-assedly. That's going to be even worse than doing things the old way. We'll write off any sort of innovation or any sort of kind of risk in terms of trying new ways of doing things, as well as fail. So it does require being able to have that conversation at all levels, at the project team and also at your executive and sponsor level, so that people can say, well, we want a successful technology project with this. This is going to have implications for the way the entire team works together.
Okay, perfect. Amy, do we have any other questions on the line?
There are no questions on the phone.
Okay. We have one other question, and I think it looks to me like the first part of this is maybe better suited to be directed towards DSS. So I'm going to direct the asker to her federal analyst, but I think that, Dan, maybe you can answer the very last part for us. So the question is, when talking about replacing a mainframe system while using a modular approach, like California has mentioned they have done, how is doing that with the feds requiring one system of record? Is California integrating with the mainframe until full implementation? So that last piece about the California experience, I think, is a good piece to touch on.
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. During the transition period, the new California system, the new CEWA system, is interfacing with the legacy mainframe system. And a key there is that an API module or an API layer is being developed, and that was the first module that was procured, and work started on that a couple months ago. And that module provides abstracted access to your single record. So while there may be multiple or different underlying databases that do different jobs, you have that single record in terms of the API module that moderates and provides access to that underlying data.
All right. And very last question. Is there enough history yet of Agile use in government settings that show a higher or visibly significant success rate versus that 3% history for waterfall successes?
Well, I think that there's a couple things to consider. One, if the current success rate is that low, I don't know if anything else could be worse, quite frankly. Like, I think actually doing nothing might be more successful than doing that.
Yeah.
So that's usually the question that's usually the question I respond to that question with is, yes, this is something different. Yes, this is something that has not been going on very long, even though the concept of modular procurement came out in 1996. In the federal government, the way it got applied was through the creation of some things called government-wide acquisition contracts, or GWACs. There's one that's operated by NASA called the Solutions for Enterprise-Wide Procurement, or NASA SOUP. It's on its 6th iteration, and it is taking an IDIQ type approach. So the problem is that some folks just didn't take it far enough. 18F is trying to purposefully build up that experience base to be able to show rather than tell people, and we're doing that through our Agile BPA with the orders that we're doing, as well as advising on things like the California system. So I would say that in the federal context, not to put like it too high of a barrier, but as Dan was honest about, there are going to be barriers to doing this. Like, folks will just not want to do it because it's different from what they're doing and it's out of their comfort zone. And I think especially when you're talking about programs and mission areas like child welfare, the question becomes, is this intrinsically valuable enough to us to warrant pushing through that hesitation to see that this succeeds? I would argue that the answer is yes, and I'm sure that there are other folks who are far far more involved in child welfare than I am on a day-to-day basis who feel the same way. So I think to that point, in terms of actual evidence, you can just very clearly go and look for IT outsourcing research. There's professors like Mary Lassity and Leslie Wilcox who've been studying how actual companies are doing multi-sourcing and doing this format of procurement. In the government, we are building that experience base.
Okay.
Yeah, and Mark mentioned, I think there's two ways of answering this. If the question is, I need proof that Agile is better than 3%, then candidly, I think you're asking the wrong question, because again, I think from my point of view and from Mark's point of view, it's hard. We just want better than 3%. In terms of actual numbers, in the best case scenario, the most successful combination of methodology and project size in terms of overall project success is small-sized Agile projects. So essentially what we're advocating for is a large investment broken up into smaller projects, each of which are delivered, smaller modular projects that are procured in a modular fashion, delivered and implemented using an Agile methodology. That brings you up to a 58% success rate using the same survey, using the same report from 2015. And that is the most successful combination of size and methodology that you're going to get. So that's Agile with small size projects. Agile as applied to large size projects, and this again kind of is a good demonstrator of the impact on just having something that is too big. Is that even when you apply a significantly better methodology like Agile to waterfall to a large-scale project, you go from the 3% success rate of waterfall to 18% for Agile. So you get a six-fold increase. But again, that success rate, even when using a iterative development methodology, just because of your large project size, you still only get to 18% in terms of what research and surveys have found in terms of success.
All right. So with that, Amy, I'll check one last time and see if we've got anyone on the phone.
No questions.
Okay, perfect. Well, we got quite a few online, so I think people were choosing that, which is perfect. Dan and Mark, I just want to thank you both so much for the time that you obviously put into creating this presentation and for being here with us today. You've covered a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time, and I really appreciate the effort and sharing your knowledge and your expertise with our audience. To our audience, this is our last webinar for this fiscal year. We'll be taking off the rest of September as far as these webinars go, and we will pick back up in October 2016 with our fiscal year 17 series. So be watching the DSS listserv for more information on that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close things up for today.
All right, thank you all so much.
Thank you.